Welcome to this Dionysius Circle event. My name is Sam Bennett, a member of the Circle. Tonight, we are happy to have Daniel Heide with us to talk about Proclus and Dionysius. Daniel has published on the Divine Names, Origin, Eriugena, Maximus the Confessor, among other things. He's going to give a 20-minute talk, and then we will open the floor for discussion. Before we get going, I just want to make a quick note that in exactly 1 month, on October 8th, the Dionysius Circle will have on Zoom its first symposium. So please see the website dionysiuscircle.org if you'd like to learn more. With that being said, thank you very much for joining us, Daniel, and please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Samuel. So just jump right in. I was thinking just a few moments ago how to think about describing this paper, and I think in a way it's a bit like Eric Pearl and Stephen Gersh through the filter of Eastern Orthodox theology, something like that. So we'll see what we all make of it. So I entitled it A Transformation of Mediation, Procline Hypostases as Dionysian Processions. And it's basically a bit of a condensed excerpt from my recent dissertation on Maximus, which I'm in the process of submitting as we speak. So recently, in my dissertation, I've argued that both Dionysius and Maximus Confessor subscribe to a doctrine of creation ex deo, or creation as divine self-impartation, such that all things are grounded in and hence derived from the one as the ultimate archaic existence. In this, they are in continuity with pagan Neoplatonists such as Plotinus and Proclus, who affirm the necessity of a unifying principle of reality without which multiplicity itself could not exist. Everything, according to the logic of Neoplatonism, depends upon oneness, for to be is to be one. Christian Neoplatonists such as Dionysius and Maximus take up this idea and adapt it to their own Christian ontologies, transforming the pagan metaphysics of monism into the Christian metaphysics of monotheism. God alone is the sole source of being, the irreducible simplicity at the heart of reality constitutive of all things. Now, this metaphysics of monism or monotheism raises a crucial problem. If all things are derived from God, in what sense can they be affirmed to be genuinely other than God? How can the one God produce the multiplicity of creation from himself without becoming implicated in it? Now, the pagan Neoplatonists tried to account for this otherness through the proliferation of mediating terms. I argue that Dionysius, following the lead of the Cappadocians, rejects this pagan approach in favor of a more immediate model of mediation. Simply put, whereas the pagan Neoplatonists conceive of being emanating from the source by means of successive subordinate hypostases, Dionysius, following the Cappadocians, understands it in proto-Palamite fashion as flowing directly from the Godhead by way of dynamic or energeic communications. I argue that this transformation of mediation leads paradoxically to both a heightened immediacy between God and creation and to the emergence of a stronger distinction between them. So Proclus. The Neoplatonic response to the problem of the one and the many, as we all know, involves the multiplication of mediating terms. For Plotinus, this takes the relatively simple form of the three hypostases, one, nous, and soul. By means of this threefold declension, the simplicity of the one progressively gives birth to the multiplicity of the world by means of mediating terms, each lesser than its prior, until it finally comes to a halt. This problem of mediation acquires a much fuller development in Proclus. In contrast to the simple triadic scheme of Plotinus, Proclus posits at least 5 hypostases. The one produces being, being begets life, life produces intellect, and intellect begets soul. In addition, it seems that nature may also represent the 6th and final hypostasis. Not entirely clear to me whether or not that's the case. In addition, we have in Proclus, we have his doctrine of henads, according to which there's a kind of unity and multiplicity within each hypostasis, including the one. Within each hypostasis, there's a threefold division into unparticipated, participated, participating. Each hypostasis, in effect, possesses an unparticipated and a participated aspect or moment, as Dylan renders it. This internal participatory relation also extends to the external relations between hypostases. Strictly speaking, only the one is absolutely imparticipable, while the monads of subsequent hypostases are only relatively imparticipable. In other words, the imparticipable monad of being participates in the one via the latter's lowest aspect, the participating henads, and so on for each of the hypostases. In this sense, the monadic principle is at once a participant in relation to its prior and unparticipated in relation to its subsequent. The lowest stage of one hypostasis coincides with the highest stage of the next. In this way, Proclus attempts to safeguard the radical simplicity of the one while allowing for a kind of mediated participatory procession into multiplicity. Typical of the Neoplatonic approach, the generative activity of the one is immediately hypostasized as a participated term. This proliferation of mediating terms linked by mutual relations of participation is illustrative of the Procline principle of continuity, such that a seamless bridge is constructed between the one and the many. So that's Proclus in a very condensed form. And so now the Cappadocians. From a Christian theological point of view, the pagan solution to the problem of the one and the many is obviously problematic, insofar as it's both subordinationist and polytheistic. After Nicaea, there's no longer any question concerning the consubstantiality of the Christian hypostases. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are homoousios, one in essence and activity, distinguished only by relation. The Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds. With the anathematization of Arius, and later Eunomius, Christianity closes the door to any kind of descending hierarchy of mediating principles so fundamental to the pagan Neoplatonists. Henceforth, the distance between the Creator and his creation will have to be overcome by other means. For the Cappadocians, this involves distinguishing between God's essence and his activities. It is the energeiai, or energies ad extra, that mediate between God and the world. While it would be anachronistic to claim that these early Christian fathers posit a developed essence energies doctrine akin to the Palamite doctrine in the 14th century, a basic distinction between the unknowable ousia of God and his knowable attributes or energies is already present in the Cappadocian fathers. So before we get to Dionysius, a brief sketch of the Cappadocian understanding of the relation between God's ousia and his energeia is in order. Now, it's in response to the challenge of Eunomius, who boldly asserted the knowability of the divine ousia, that a nascent essence activity distinction emerges in the thought of Basil and the two Gregories, Nazianzus and Nyssa. For the sake of brevity, I will focus only on Gregory of Nyssa's formulations alone. For Eunomius, names are indicative of essence, such that to know the name of God is to know the essence of God. Beyond the obvious philosophical problems that arise from defining and thus finitizing God, Eunomius' position leads to the theological problem of subordinationism. If the appellation unbegotten applies essentially to God the Father, while begotten applies essentially to the Son, then clearly the latter cannot be homoousios with the Father, for unbegotten and begotten are essentially two different things. In response to this, the Cappadocians categorically deny that the divine ousia is in any way knowable and that the divine names are in any way essentially predicable of God. In terms of unbegotten, begotten, and proceeding, these are simply terms of relation, skesis, pointing to the fact that the Father is the arche of the Son and the Holy Spirit. All other names refer not to the divine ousia, but to the energeiai, the activities of God ad extra. It's by way of these latter, then, that we receive knowledge of the unknowable. It is here that we encounter the source material for Dionysius' treatment on the divine names. In speaking of the various names ascribed to Christ in the scriptures, be it door, bread, vine, way, light, stone, shepherd, etc., Gregory of Nyssa argues that these apply not to the divine ousia, but to the energeiai. Quote, each one of these titles, onomaton, is not the nature, the physis of the only begotten, not his deity, not the character of his being. Nevertheless, he is so named, and the naming is valid, for it is right to consider that there is nothing idle or meaningless among the divine words. What we say is this: as the Lord in various ways provides for human life, each variety of benefit is identified in turn by one or other such title, the foresight, pronias, and action, energias, therein observed becoming a particular kind of name, onomata. That's great. That's Gregory. So Gregory proceeds by denying that the multiplicity of divine names are applicable to the simplicity of the divine essence, while at the same time affirming that they are nonetheless valid and meaningful in relation to God. In a sense, Gregory shares the robust realism of Eunomius. If words are to have meaning, if scripture is not mere idle talk, if theology is to be a legitimate pursuit, then it must be possible to talk about God in some substantial way. Where Eunomius goes astray is in his belief that he can name, and thus know, the divine ousia itself. This Gregory emphatically denies, arguing that what we can know, and thus name, is the diversity of God's providential activities, his energeias. It is clear, he concludes, quote, that the divinity is given names with various connotations in accordance with the variety of his activities, ton energeion. In this discussion of the divine names, then we encounter a clear distinction between God's unknowable ousia and his knowable energeiae, the latter being here identified with divine providence. Now, the question, of course, is what exactly are these energeiae? Are they some sort of divine communications ad extra, energies in the Palamite sense, or merely operations in a more Thomistic sense? The answer, I believe, is that they are both. Gregory alludes to this when he says that God reveals himself to us, quote, both by the miracles which are revealed in the works, piuntes, done by him, and from the titles, onomaton, by which the various aspects of divine power, dynamios, are perceived. So the reference to miracles suggests a temporal operatio, a divine intervention within the created order, something which God does. On the other hand, the mention of divine powers linked to the energeiae by their association with the divine names suggests something timeless pertaining to God himself, something which God is. This accords with Gregory's understanding of the energeiae as divine attributes. Just as we can describe the outward characteristics of a person without knowing their inward nature, says Gregory, so, quote, all the words found in Holy Scripture indicate God's glory, describe something of the manifestations around God. His being itself, his ousia, however, Scripture leaves uninvestigated as beyond the reach of mind and inexpressible in word. In this passage, Gregory expands the scope of the divine names from works, powers, and energies to include the divine attributes around God, puri ton theon, which he identifies with the divine glory. God's glory, to which there are numerous scriptural attestations, is not merely some operation, something which God does, but clearly something which God in some sense is. And I've left out passages from Nazianzen and Basil, who of course confirm all of this in even more detail. So in essence, what we're confronted with in Gregory's formulations are the consequences of the Christian suppression of mean terms. In the absence of subordinate principles, God is at once ineffable simplicity, the one beyond thought and being, and at the same time the source of multiplicity. In their struggle with Eunomius, the Cappadocians grapple with how to affirm both the divine simplicity and the diversity that proceeds from God. On the one hand, there is no place for the divine attributes within the divine ousia. On the other hand, there are no subordinate hypostases to contain them, and yet they must be affirmed, for Scripture and creation bear witness to the diversity of the divine energies as both knowable and nameable. So, Dionysius. If it is with the Cappadocians that we first encounter evidence of a profoundly altered metaphysics, it is nonetheless true that this represents a somewhat oblique engagement with the ontological problem of the one and the many. It is with Dionysius that we first encounter a direct engagement with the philosophical problem of mediation. Perhaps the most explicit example of this is found in a powerful passage in the Divine Names, which I'm sure you all know, where Dionysius takes direct aim at the metaphysics of Proclus with its proliferation of mediating terms. So, quote, I do not say that the good is one thing, being another, life and wisdom yet others, nor that there are multiple causes and different godheads, superior and inferior, and all producing different effects, but that all these good processions and divine names celebrated by us are of the one God, and that the first name tells of the universal providence of the one God, while the other names reveal providence as more general or more specific, end quote. So Dionysius here explicitly rejects Proclus mediating terms. there is no descending hierarchy of hypostases, such that the one produces being, which produces life, which produces intellect or wisdom, which produces soul, and so on. Nor are there multiple principles or divinities responsible for specific entities, so that being is the cause of existence, life the cause of vital existence, and wisdom the cause of vital intelligent existence. Instead, the entire scheme is radically leveled and attributed in its entirety to the one God. What were multiple subordinate divinities in Proclus are now varying measures of a single universal providence, the manifold processions of a unitary good. This change marks a radical new approach to the problem of the one and the many. Rather than try to resolve the tension through the postulation of intermediaries, Dionysius, following the lead of his Cappadocian teachers, locates the source of multiplicity and hence otherness within the first principle itself. Now, Eric Pearl makes the interesting point that this transformation is not merely a response to theological concerns, but is in fact the ultimate solution to the philosophical problem of sameness and otherness. Pearl makes this point in his sort of famous unpublished dissertation on Maximals. For no matter how many intermediaries are posited between the imparticipable one and the many participants, the fundamental problem of the one and the many remains. Whence comes the necessary otherness, however subtly it is rendered? How is it possible for simplicity to be the source of diversity? In Pearl's view, Dionysius, to his great credit, chooses to face the problem head on. Instead of multiplying intermediaries, which arguably serve merely to obscure rather than resolve the antinomy, and which lead inevitably to subordinationism and polytheism, Dionysius fiercely proclaims that the one God is the sole immediate source of the many. Even more radically than Plotinus, then, Dionysius proclaims that God is all things in all things and nothing in any. Once again, however, the question arises as to the nature of these manifold processions of the one God. For though Dionysius rejects their status as hypostases, he nonetheless affirms them as the multiple expressions of divine providence. An important clue in the above passage is Dionysius' identification of God's providential processions with the divine names, an identification we encountered in Gregory of Nyssa. Indeed, the divine names could itself be understood as a kind of commentary on Gregory of Nyssa's doctrine of divine onomata. To cite a few examples, Dionysius says that, quote, all that the sacred hymnologies of the theologians say regarding the divine names, the theonymias, refer in revealing praises to the beneficent processions, the proodus, of the thearchy. Like Gregory, Dionysius called these processions powers, dynamis. Again, quote, whenever we name onomasimen, the super-essential hiddenness God, when we call this hiddenness God or life or essence or light or logos, we indicate nothing, he says, other than the essence-making, life-begetting, wisdom-bestowing dynamis which proceed to us from him. Finally, like the Cappadocians, Dionysius identifies the powers and providences of God with the energeiae when he speaks of the, quote, providential processions and energies whereby God creates, sustains, and encompasses the whole of creation. All of this indicates that Dionysius subscribes to a similar distinction as the Cappadocians between God's hidden ousia and his manifest energeiae, though Dionysius formulates it in ontological terms as a distinction between the one God and his multiple manifestations. The inexpressible one is beyond naming, yet reveals himself to us in the divine names by which Scripture hymns, quote, the beneficent processions, the energeiae of God ad extra. So while Dionysius adopts the Neoplatonic language of procession, proidos, his meaning is fundamentally different than that of Plotinus and Proclus. For him, the energeic processions are not lower effects of the supreme cause, but the immediate self-disclosure of the cause itself. For Dionysius, as with the Cappadocians, the energies do not immediately coalesce into hypostases, but remain iridescent and dynamic. They are the providential proidae, the being-making, life-begetting, wisdom-bestowing dynamis, which constitute the world. Further evidence of Dionysius' transformation of Neoplatonic mediation may be found in his reworking of Proclus' threefold schematic of unparticipated, participated, participating. So back to this tongue twister. Dionysius responds to a query as to how the one God can be addressed by multiple names, such as being itself, life itself, or power itself. His answer is both expected and enigmatic. None of these names refer to additional principles, says Dionysius, but, quote, are derived from beings and especially from the primary beings, ton protos onton, and analogously attributed to God as the cause who transcends being, again, including the primary beings, ta protos onta. So given his uncompromising rejection of subordinate existences, what are we to make of this peculiar reference to primary beings, these onta? Dionysius promptly gives us the answer. The primary beings, he says, refer to the, quote, providential powers, which come forth from the unparticipated God, according to which beings are participants in the gifts of existence, life, and so on. Actually, end quote was a few words prior. The so-called primary beings, or primary realities, the onta, are evidently a stand-in for Proclus's mediated terms, mediating between the unparticipated arche and the manifold participants. And yet, given the suppression of mean terms, these onta are not hypostasized realities, but dynamic communications of God ad extra. They are, in fact, the being-making, life-begetting, wisdom-bestowing dynames, as he names them. That Dionysius refers to them in ontic terms underscores the realism of the providential powers. Though not separate hypostases, they are substantial expressions of God, the self-disclosure of the one as many. The paradoxical character of the powers, processions, or energies of God is further illustrated when Dionysius says of the divine differentiations that, quote, it is according to these gifts that the beings which are imparticipably participated are hymned through the participations and those who participate, end quote. That the primary beings are themselves imparticipably participated represents a revealing oddity. According to the Procline scheme, there is no reason for the middle terms to be described in this way. They are simply participated, while only the first term in the triad is said to be unparticipated. According to Dionysius, however, not only is the transcendent Godhead said to be imparticipable, but even the participated processions are in some sense imparticipable. This points once again to the suppression of mean terms. Insofar as the communications of God at extra simply are God, they too are unparticipated. Insofar as they represent God in his knowable immanent aspect, they are participated. The paradoxical nature of all of this stems from the rejection of mediating hypostases, such that the antinomy of sameness and otherness is confronted head-on. God is at once simple and manifold, transcendent and immanent, unknowable and knowable. In conclusion, Dionysius' transformation of mediation does not resolve the ancient antinomy of the one and the many, any more than do the mediating terms of Plotinus and Proclus. To the contrary, it radicalizes it, such that beings both are and are not derived directly from God. The problem with the pagan position from a Christian point of view is that the proliferation of intermediaries means that the dividing line between the one and the many is never entirely clear. Indeed, the whole thrust of the great chain of being is precisely to establish this continuity. While both Plotinus and Proclus insist upon a fundamental distinction between the one as uncaused and all subsequent principles as caused, the seamless bridge constructed between the one and the many, especially as one finds it in the later Neoplatonism of Proclus, renders the distinction between God and world ambiguous. For the pagans, this may well be a laudable achievement. In a way, it's what they want to do. From a Christian perspective, however, which places a much higher premium upon the otherness of God in relation to the world, the pagan emphasis upon sameness can seem dangerously pantheistic. Paradoxically, by drawing a distinction between God's unknowable ousia and his energeic processions, Dionysius renders the world at once more immediately related to God and more clearly distinguished from him. On one side of the great divide dwells the invisible and unnameable creator. On the other side is visible contingent creation. What mediates between them are God's own providential processions, which traverse the chasm without bridging it. That is, energetically rather than ontically. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it. Okay, well, yeah. So now we have some. Obviously, we have at least 40 minutes or so for discussion. And I guess I guess I'll do the first question if that's all right, and then just let me know. One way we can do it, guys, is or if you just type into the chat, I have a question, I could then turn to you, however, like that.
Yeah, why don't you just chair it, Samuel, and we'll rely on you to keep things flowing. So.
Great, sounds good. Okay, so I guess one question I have is, would you agree that you talked about how the processions, unlike in Neoplatonism, they're not lower effects of the ultimate principle, the ultimate first principle. Instead, they're immediate self-disclosure of the cause.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that, I guess is there a sense in which saying their immediate self-disclosure of the cause is paradoxical insofar as the ultimate first principle is the one? It seems like it's not it's different than being qua the form of beings, or wisdom qua the form of the wise, or life qua the principle of living things. In other words, when we think about the life of the living, it seems like we're thinking about a distinct principle which distinguishes the living beings from other kinds of living beings. And thus, insofar as we're thinking of it as a distinct principle, it seems like it can't immediately be a disclosure of the one.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, would you say that the paradox that you're talking about, is it contained in that phrase that the processions are the immediate self-disclosure of the cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really agree with Eric Pearl that in a way, I think, I mean, even when Plotinus says, he calls it a marvel, a thauma, how the one can give many, can be the source of multiplicity. It's somehow technically impossible, and yet somehow it has to be, because when we seek the ultimate principle, it's a process of reduction. We need to get to one thing to find the ultimate truth. And yet when we have this one, then we have this problem with, well, how can that give manyness? And yet there is manyness in the world. This is undeniable. So I think, I don't know if this really answers your problem. I'm maybe just repeating what I said in the paper, but in a way there is I like this term antinomy that some of the sort of 20th century Orthodox theologians have sort of taken on, the fact that in a way we have to affirm both of these poles, maybe without trying too hard to rationalize them away. We have to learn to be comfortable to hold that tension and say God is both one and the source of many, even though we can't really say how that is so. I think the sort of distinction between the ousia and the attributes or energies is a way of articulating that. I don't know if it resolves it, but I think it gives us language to express it, to articulate the problem. In a way, I think we have to affirm the problem and not rush to try to articulate it. I may be going off in a bit of a different direction from what you were asking. Would you like to respond to that? Or
no, I mean,
question?
although, I think that's responsive, and it reminds me a little bit of the kind of Kuzin way of thinking about God, where in a certain sense you attribute at least formal contradictions. Obviously, God is not actually contradictory, but formally speaking, you attribute contradictions to indicate. I mean,
and of course we're deeply in the apophatic here, right? Especially, I identify as an Orthodox theologian, so it's for me, of course, Dionysius is the king of the apophatic. So I mean, everything, we have these concepts which help us to think God to a certain extent, but at some point we have to leap beyond them, right? We can't expect our formulations to be watertight. They never will be, right? That would be to turn the divine into some sort of idol. So we philosophize as best we can, and at some point we have to go beyond philosophy. But nonetheless, here we are trying to understand things.
And I guess I'll go to Michael in just a moment. But I guess I'm just thinking about Proclus, like I suppose, you're mentioning that it must be the case, but we cannot precisely grasp. I guess, at least for Proclus, maybe it doesn't solve the problem like Pearl says, but I guess there is that positing of the henads as a kind of intermediary step, helping, because very early on in the elements we learned that the multitude must be in some way one, or else it would be an infinity of infinities, and then to kind of and then of course proposition 6 he posits the henads as a way of explaining how that thing that we know must be the case occurs. How that anyway, at any rate, I'll go to Michael here.
Hey, thanks. So I guess my question is, how do you think of, maybe the best way to put it is, as I'll try to sort of like put forward a way I'm thinking of it, and then see if you agree or disagree or have something to say about it. But I guess I've always kind of thought, differentiating Proclus from Dionysius, that in a way the processions are taking the place of the henads, and then everything below, like being, life, intellect, those are, in Dionysius, those would be hierarchies of angels. So those are creatures, actually. And so in that way, it's closer, I think, to Proclus than you're describing it.
Yes.
But I'm wondering what you think of that, to have like the celestial hierarchy sort of take the place of the being, life, intellect hierarchy, I guess, in Proclus.
That's a really great question. My portrait is really exclusively on the divine names and the mystical theology, and you're absolutely right. The celestial hierarchy, in a way, you find that mediation coming back in. And I'm not entirely clear, to be honest, how to resolve that. I mean, because I'm not entirely clear what Dionysius means by these angelic hierarchy. I mean, is it an ontological hierarchy, or is it simply, he seems to present it more as being simply a way of mediating divine knowledge, but one could potentially interpret that as ontological. I mean, as Pearl always says, the unity of thought and being. So if every level of insight is also somehow corresponds to being. So I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer. I think it's something that needs to be thought through. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. I mean, I was really focusing on that one very sort of poignant passage in the Divine Names where he seems quite literally to be taking Proclus to task, right? He's saying there's no being, no life, no nothing, and he's identifying them with processions. But then how to make sense of his sort of celestial hierarchy, I think, is an open question. So it depends on how we interpret that. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a fantastic question. If anyone else has any thoughts on it, I'd be happy to listen. Jonathan has a thought.
Thank you. Doesn't Pearl say something about how like the being, life, and mind are not like different things? It's the same thing in a higher intensity, right? So that the being that I share and that the rock shares is the same being, right? But that because I have life and mind, I'm just at a higher intensity, right? So that so they're not like different, they're not being added, right? Whereas I feel like that it does not help answer the kind of question that both of you were raising, of how there's difference, but there's not difference. Right, with these things. Am I understanding properly what the problem is?
The lower is always enfolded in the higher, so that, which is always right, that puzzle. If being is higher than life, how can being be higher than life? We think it seems like it's more primitive, but actually because being actually contains life and intellect, sort of, right, potentially. So I think Dodds makes that nice comment somewhere in the comments that somehow the one has to be potentially all things, and again, that's Plotinus doesn't want to say that, he really doesn't want to actually say it, but in a way, because there's always that risk again of somehow importing multiplicity into the one, and yet somehow it kind of has to be there already. Yeah. Anyone else want to add to that? I mean, these are questions for me just as much as for you guys. I don't claim to have solved anything.
I mean, I'll say one thing just real briefly about Michael, what you said about bringing in the celestial hierarchy. I guess the only question that if you rely too much on the celestial hierarchy, then you might end up having a situation where God ends up not being the immediate cause of all things. And you do want all of reality to be in a kind of immediate gift of God. So anyway, I just throw that out there. I think that, I mean, obviously, Michael, you're right to bring that up, but that's kind of the question that brings up for me, is that we emphasize that too much, then we might end up making God the cause of all.
Yeah, that's a good point, Samuel. And I feel as though the subsequent tradition maybe doesn't quite know what to do with the celestial hierarchy. I mean, I think they see it as a sort of rare authoritative account of the angels, but it doesn't seem to really do any ontological work after Dionysius, and maybe not even in Dionysius. I don't know. I think it's there's a lot. Well, it's Dionysius, right? So we could spend our lifetimes trying to understand what he's getting at. But I think you're right, Samuel. That idea of mediation is for Christianity a bit awkward, right? And we don't want to take that too far.
Yeah, Marcus, do you have a...
Yeah, on the question of the hierarchy. So one thing that I got from reading the celestial hierarchy was that there seems to be a kind of harmony between the mediation of the different levels and the presence of God at the same time, together with that mediation. That's certainly something that Pearl emphasizes, at least. He makes a lot of the passage in which Dionysius interprets Isaiah 6, where the angel, a lower angel, forget how it goes exactly, but he's essentially acting as a seraph.
Yeah, the seraphim shouldn't be able to do that, according to the hierarchy. Go on, continue.
Right, so that doesn't really exactly solve anything, but it seems like it could be relevant here. A harmony between the mediating action and the presence of the transcendent at the same time.
Yeah, I'm just reminded of years ago I read, I used to read a lot more Pierre Hadot, and he talks about, Plotinus as like levels of the self. And I used to have this thought, is the Dionysian hierarchy, in a way, could we think of it as levels of the self, in the sense of like a spiritual ladder, like that we can ascend to the level of a certain, we start at the angel to archangel. Could this represent a kind of spiritual ascent? I don't think Dionysius makes that very explicit, but that's maybe another possibility. That's maybe getting away from our topic a little bit. Alex has a comment. Where's Alex?
Thank you for the talk. It was very good. So one comment and then one question. So on the celestial hierarchy, this is something that might open up avenues in theology and kind of downstream in different areas, especially dealing with, say, the problem of evil. If you start to take into account, so maybe the angels have some sort of ontological role in organizing reality, and if you take into account some kind of angelic fall, that could account for, say, problems of natural evil. So there's interesting avenues that open up there that maybe still could make celestial hierarchies relevant, at least in terms of theodicy. But a question I had for you, this is something, and this is my own ignorance of this subject, and maybe you could help kind of illuminate this for me. I am coming at this from more of a Catholic perspective, and so the essence energies distinction is something that's still relatively alien. But how is it possible to have, say, the energies of God without introducing something like a fourth hypostasis into the Trinity, or like some other kind of distinction in God like that? I know that's a huge question, and that kind of gets to the heart of a lot of the Palamite thinking on that. But I was curious if you could just say a couple words about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know if I really have an answer. I was sort of expecting some sort of question like that to arise, because it's this essence-energy distinction generally isn't very well understood or even very well received outside the Orthodox tradition. For the Orthodox, it's really seems to become quite normative in many ways. I don't know. I mean, it's a legitimate question. I mean, obviously, it's not a fourth hypostasis, quite literally. Because it's quite the opposite. It's actually a dynamic sort of energy. I don't know. In some ways, sometimes it doesn't seem so complicated if one thinks simply about, let us replace the language of energies with grace. In a way, there's nothing controversial that the divine has some sort of grace. There's nothing controversial that the sun has energy that it radiates, which both warmth and sunlight both is the sun and is also distinct from the sun in a way. So for me, this isn't really a problem, but I'm also not a Latin theologian. So perhaps, in the simplicity, maybe I'm taking refuge in the apophatic too much. I don't know. Maybe I should worry about it more than I do. So I probably don't have a satisfactory answer for you. But I don't know if thinking about it as grace helps, that there is a sort of constitutive energy that comes forth from the divine, which I think one would expect. One would expect the Godhead to have some sort of influence on reality, not just to be this kind of distant thing that doesn't impact us in some way. I don't know what. That's my very sort of primitive attempt at an answer.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny. I've had similar discussions with a very dear friend of mine who's an Eastern Orthodox seminarian. And I brought up almost the exact same point that you had, where it's like, this just sounds like grace. Like, this just sounds like what the West would call grace. So I think it's just very similar, where there doesn't really seem to be that much of a difference. But yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. I think with the Orthodox, there is maybe this is dissatisfactory for the non-Orthodox, but there is at some point we're not afraid to sort of turn to images and kind of work with it on that level. In some sense, we have to. But I'm sure there's philosophers that have better answers to that conundrum. But anything else that we want to discuss?
I know Carson has a question. I think.
Yes, Daniel, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
I think one of the interesting parts of your talk was this idea of the names as, I forget the exact term, but almost iridescent.
Yeah, what did I?
Where the divine names.
Radiations or something, yeah.
Yeah, they're not, the divine names that we're talking about, they're not capturing some sort of complete object. There's something kind of dynamic going on where the name picks out something, but there's always.
You're cutting out for me.
Okay, am I good now?
Could you go through that again? I missed. You cut out for me. I don't know about other people.
Sure. So the name doesn't just pick out a complete object. It seems like it does pick out something, but there's this kind of iridescence or dynamism that you're referring to. I'm wondering if that responds to some fundamental need of humanity to have this receding horizon of love. And so it actually makes philosophical sense to talk about this iridescence of the name, or whether Dionysius's alteration of Proclus is based on just trying to make it fit a prior dogma. So we just have these dogmas, and so I'm going to employ this idea of the names in accordance with Gregory and the Cappadocians. So I guess my question is, this interesting dynamism of the names, is it a necessary philosophical response to something, or is the motive for it more trying to just capture what makes sense to Christians without trying to be a philosophical explanation?
Well, maybe the answer is both. I mean, I do tend to read things through the philosophers, and certainly the early fathers are deeply philosophical thinkers, but they're also spiritual fathers. It's not merely sort of head game or a logical puzzle for them. So I think you're onto something there. But I don't know. I think, like in many ways, it's with, like with Palamas later on. That's why I don't think it's anachronistic to sort of bring him in a sort of cautious way. I think it's always we're trying to sort of, it's the reality of our experience that, I mean, in a way, I suppose philosophically, theologically, God has to be unknowable, because the moment we think God becomes a finite being. So as the very ground of being, God has to be beyond being and hence unknowable. And yet here's this reality. And all the fathers affirm that it is shot through with divine grace, that the divine is something that's also intimate to us. And so how do we articulate that, right? And so I think on one level, I'm construing it as a sort of response in a more ontological, philosophical way. But I think especially for the Cappadocian, it's very much sort of experiential. And it certainly is for Palamas. He's trying to affirm, how can the unknowable God be knowable? The mystics are saying we're having experiences of light. We're having all these experiences. We're knowing the unknowable. How can that be? And so he comes up with this distinction. And I think the Cappadocians, in a way, are dealing with it on a slightly different level. And Dionysius, of course, is a great philosopher. He thinks it a little bit more abstractly. So I think maybe I would say both to yours. I've definitely been emphasizing the philosophical, of course, but
I wonder if the basis in experience might call forth this idea of the iridescent name, because you have an experience of God. It's something that's not completely exhausting God. It's always
exactly,
you're sort of experiencing God, but it's ever receding. So I wonder if they started with the concrete experience of saints who are sort of shining forth light, and then saying, oh, well, we have to make sense of this in terms of theology, and a name that we just picked out a complete object wouldn't sort of jive with this experience. So I think maybe that's one way to motivate this idea of the names is starting from the experience, the revelation of God. So thank you very much.
No, that's great. I think that's true. I mean, I think we always have to remember that these guys aren't merely sort of academic theologians. They're living in the desert. They're monastics. Their primary purpose is prayer, essentially. And I think you were sort of alluding to, we were talking about the Cappadocians, and of course Gregory has the famous doctrine of eternal progress, right? That you never get your fill of the divine, because there's always something more. Which is a good thing. You're never going to get bored of the divine. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Daniel, I have a question to dovetail on that about experience and participation. So because the name is something that we as a subject put on an object, right? And you could almost say that to attribute something is more about the one who is attributing rather than the one that is attributed, right? And so how much do we how much do you think the well, to back up, I'm a big proponent that there is a single divine energy that's then participated in a multiplicity of ways, not that there are actually ontologically distinct energies. But I'm curious from your angle, how much you feel that the distinction in the participation of God, who is infinite, and I don't know about you, but I participate with things in a finite way, so then there would then be an infinite number of ways to participate with God, which then could be infinitely distinct, but yet the thing I'm participating with is nonetheless one. How much do you feel that the participation in the procession is based on us and our participation, and how much do you think it is actually like itself is, dare I say, many in it? Does my question make sense?
I think so. I mean, it's a very difficult topic. Well, I'm not sure I quite understand, but one thought that comes to mind is, of course, I mean, the energies themselves, insofar as they are God ad extra, are themselves infinite and ultimately ungraspable, and in a way, even maybe themselves beyond names, because you can't ultimately finitize even the energies of God. But, I think the Orthodox distinction is often that, in a way, the energies are always, in a way, kind of infinite, like grace is always streaming out, but there's always this talk of our capacity, right? So there's something finitizing about ourselves as finite beings. We only have a certain limited capacity for grace, and this is, of course, why asceticism is always essential to any sort of philosophy. Knowledge and virtue are inseparable. You can't become wise and knowledgeable if you don't also practice ascesis, because if you're full of your egotism, then you don't have any room for the divine. So in a way, we have to constantly work to make ourselves receptive to the energies, because the energies are infinite. But of course, as finite beings, we will never. We can only take an infinitesimal amount. We're finite vessels, I would say, of an infinite energeia. I don't know if that's anywhere close to what you were talking about, but
it is a very difficult question to consider. Yeah, but no, that was very good. Thank you.
I'll just add as a little aside. I deal with this a little bit more. I don't know if Dionysius deals with it, but in my dissertation on Maximus, I sort of argue that he brings in the idea of the logos as a kind of differentiating principle, which kind of serves in a way to finitize the energies. Maximus talks about the eternal erga and the finite, the eternal and the temporal works and all that. I don't know if you guys are readers of Maximus, but I think maybe he addresses that problem a little bit more that Dionysius does not, because Dionysius is all like inspired utterance and doesn't really give us a lot of philosophical details, right? But yeah, thank you. Father Silouan has a question, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Father.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned St. Maximus, because in the back of my mind, I was thinking about how all of this applies to Ambiguous 7. And have you thought about how the one and the many and the Procline problem as Saint Dionysius like dealt with it, how then that question transfers via that ambiguum in Saint Maximus? Because I think he deals with it in a very, what I like about this question is the possibility of keeping things blurry.
Yeah, I'm all for keeping things blurry. We don't usually like it, but I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and with Ambiguum 7, you really get this notion that, all right, hold on, he's talking about the logos, but then he's saying that he divides himself. What does that mean? It's like, and then, so there is maintained this intimacy, I guess I would call, between the logoi and the logos, while also upholding the distinction.
Yes.
And that is, I think, the beauty of the way Saint Maximus articulates it, that perhaps is lacking in the Proclean multiplication of like henads. And it seems like there's always an attempt to separate, keep things apart. You don't want to taint the one.
That's right. That's right.
But Saint Maximus is kind of like, well, the one is already all over the place, man. He's playing all over the place. So what are you worried about? You should be relishing the fact that the logoi are like inhabiting the logos and vice versa. Yeah. So anyway, so how do you see Saint Dionysius within that trajectory as it culminates in Saint Maximus?
Yeah. Great question. Wow. I mean, I don't know if I'm prepared to answer it in detail, but much of my dissertation is directly about that.
Excellent.
One of the most, I think, astonishing things about Maximus is that the one literally enters into the world as the many. There's no trickling down. It's like the one himself goes right into the material world, which I think would be completely shocking to a Plotinus. So there's something like you were pointing to that. So it's too complicated, I think, for me to articulate here. But I have this argument in my dissertation where what I see in Maximus is, in a way, that because he's such a great, in ways, syncretist in the best sense of that term, right? He draws in everybody. And I think in Maximus, there's actually, in a way, two models of mediation. He has this essence energies that he gets from the Cappadocians and Dionysius. And then he has the logos, which he gets from essentially Origin, and transforms it and does all sorts of wonderful new things with it. And I try to make the argument that, in a way, he brings both of these models together, and that the logos, in a way, provides this kind of principle of differentiation. And I borrow a little bit of Jordan Daniel Wood's really intriguing recent work, which you may be familiar with. My take isn't quite as radical, but I sort of follow Jordan Wood a bit and say that again, part of this immediacy is that there's no room in Christianity for a nous, for a one many, because that would already be a subordinate principle. So the logos isn't a nous. The logos is one, like the Platonian one, and also somehow many, like the nous. And the way I think I argue is that the logos is in a way one in his transcendence and only actually many in his immanence. So there's always this immediacy of multiplicity, that the one becomes many right in the act of creation. And in a way, it's like the logos is a kind of prism through which the energies pass through.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. The whole prismic.
Because I think that in Dionysius, we don't have an explanation for how the energies become finitized. And I think Maximus provides us with that. At least that's what I'm trying to argue.
Interesting.
Yeah, but great question. Yeah, I'm all over Maximus with this question, and it's a very complicated one. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Since you brought up Plotinus and maybe being worried about defilement of the one, I don't know, Dr. Butler, if you happen to have any comments, but invite that.
But I don't want to push some sort of Christian Neoplatonic polemic there. I love the Neoplatonists, right? We have to be careful with drawing too strong a comparison between the two. But if anyone wants to offer a rebuttal, that would be.
I've got a quick question about subordinationism. What's the problem with subordination? Is it just because we can't say that as Christians, we can't have subordination? Or does the theory of mean terms, there's something just philosophically problematic about it? Like it doesn't actually explain reality. And then we're looking for another answer, and it's got to be the Trinity. It's got to be Christianity. So I'm wondering, when you're saying subordination, is it just, okay, well, that can't be right because we accept the dogma, or is it can't be right because it has its own problems as a philosophy?
Yeah, good question. No, it can't be right because it undermines the economy of salvation. Who is Christ? Christ is, you could say, the supreme symbol. In the Greek sense of symbolon, that he is the thing that brings heaven and earth together. And in order for him to do that, see, it's really soteriological much more than anything else. The logos can't be subordinate because then he's not fully divine. And if he's not fully divine, then he can't serve as that bridge between heaven and earth, as it were. So subordinationism, the dogma affirms, this basic soteriological necessity that if Christ is to be the savior of the world, he has to be 100% divine, and that means uncompromisingly so.
Right. Okay. So that sounds like the starting point is the dogma. So we want to preserve the dogma.
Well, but what does the dogma express? The dogma is trying to articulate a fundamental spiritual reality. That Christ is this bridge.
I agree. Totally with it. I'm just wondering. So, like, for example, you mentioned Pearl's dissertation. I think he finds dilemmas in Neoplatonic participation itself. And then the dogma sort of makes sense of how there really could be participation through, the having to accept a kind of paradox. But, I think some of the things he mentions there is there's some sort of infinite regress problem with the intermediaries.
Yeah. I think
so that's what I'm wondering. Like, is there, if we didn't have any dogmas, if there was no Christianity, would it just be the subordinationist theory would make sense, or it's just inherently implausible, rationally speaking? And then we're like kind of seeking, okay, this is a dilemma. This doesn't actually solve the one and the many. What could solve it? And then it's like, oh, well, here's the way to solve it through Christ,
my response was a soteriological one, but I think that would be worth exploring. Does the incarnation resolve that philosophical problem? I don't know one way or the other, but I think that would be an interesting. Sorry, my dog is harassing me.
No, it's okay. One thought I mentioned earlier was that if it could somehow explain some desire that we have as humans for an infinite personal relationship.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't just have the one
No.
and that satisfy this desire for an unending personal relationship with another person. I think Staniloy talked about this in The Experience of God, Volume 1. He actually invokes Karl Rahner, the Catholic theologian, that there's this transcendental desire for Christ on behalf of the human subject. So you would kind of be trying to explain this desire if it exists. If you show it exists, that human beings do desire this infinite communion that never ends. Then you could say, okay, well, does Neoplatonism explain that? Does it account for it? And then if it doesn't, it's like, well, then it can't be true, because we know that humans have this desire. But wait a minute, Christ actually unites this striving for absolute unity, but also is a person that we can interact with eternally. Now, I asked Lloyd Gerson about this, and he doesn't think that you can show, at least if I remember right, I don't think he thought that you could show that there is this fundamental desire on behalf of the human subject for another person, an infinite person that you interact with. So I think that's an interesting, I mean, I don't want to talk too long here, but I think this idea of starting from the subject and saying, you know, can you show that we wouldn't be satisfied as humans unless we had an eternal, not just an eternal object or an eternal one, but an eternal person. And then go from there, and then the kind of iridescence of the names and the kind of experience of the saints would all kind of make sense of that fact of nature. Yeah. I mean, Gerson may well be right that I mean, philosophically, this can't be articulated in some sort of syllogism. Doesn't mean it's untrue. It's just something that's maybe beyond philosophy. But I don't know if this is relevant, but I remember one of my teachers saying that in a way what Christianity maybe had that enabled it to sort of triumph over the previous sort of pagan view was that the pagans were never able in a way to integrate, you know, philosophy and sort of religion, you know, like that you had the myths and the gods. They tried a little bit, Proclus, of course, but in a way they never had a compelling narrative, you know, and maybe, you know, the one remains, you know, maybe arguably, I mean, for Plotinus, the one seems to be something that's very real and potent, but yeah, maybe there's something there lacking in the pagan worldview, that they weren't able to have this person, this really sort of fleshed out real. I see Dr. Butler here. I think he probably would have something to say about that regarding the myths and the gods in the pagan world.
Yeah.
Great.
I think that you managed to.
Oh, we can't hear.
We can't quite hear you, Dr. Butler.
Oh, wait a second.
I can hear, but it's very, very faint.
It cut out then. Yeah.
Trouble with my microphone setting. Is that good?
That's better. Yeah.
Better.
Better. Yeah.
I'll stick my ear in my screen.
I suppose that you did finally manage to lure me out from my sort of lofty pagan disdain. I'll normally I generally feel that you know, there's a lot as a Proclus specialist, there's a lot I find that just isn't really relevant to even get into when you're then talking about the Christian appropriation of Platonic thought, because there's a lot there in Proclus that just once you accept that it's just going to drop out. There's not that much that's then worth arguing about in terms of the details of the kind of Dionysian picture then that gets argued out at great length and with great subtlety. But what I would say is that on my reading of Proclus, the multiplicity of gods is precisely an immediate presence of the one to the world. It's not a mediating factor in the way that you're talking about. That would be something that would separate the world from the one, from the gods. It just is the presence of the one, which is ultimately the existence of each god. And so my reading of Proclus in many ways looks a lot more like like the kind of monotheist reading that you're talking about, but it's present in each god. And then the procession to lower ontological levels, lower ontological planes, actually has to do with the increasing mediation between the gods, as opposed to the ultimate presence of the first hypostasis, which is the presence of all the gods immediately in each one. And so then the whole point of procession then isn't that we multiply gods. The point of procession is that we actually increase the amount of mediation among the many gods, so that at the bottom, we actually get a more unified picture. Because what is ineffable about the ultimate Hanatic multiplicity, the ultimate Hanatic manifold, what's ineffable about it is precisely the uniqueness of each god. Because the one is the principle of uniqueness, ultimately. And so from that point of view, I mean, you talk about that the Platonists have a concern about the one getting contaminated or something like that with multiplicity. I mean, it's really, from my point of view, just a logical question that, the one is the principle of unity. And if we start importing different kinds of causality in it, beyond that, then we're simply confusing the matter. It's not a question of some kind of contamination, but it's just a question of confusing the matter. I mean, the Platonic perspective is just basically that, principles which are logically distinct are hypostatically distinct. Just to avoid the elementary confusion that would arise from conflating different kinds of causality in a single hypostasis. So I mean, that's just basically where I'm coming from. But the many gods is precisely, from my point of view, the presence of the one to the world immediately. Because there are gods immediately causing every level of being. It's not just the hierarchy trickling down. Because each level of being is also immediately caused by a certain class of henads that are themselves all super essential. They're all super essential.
Thank you, Professor. That's I think I actually agree with everything you say, and I always feel a certain discomfort even in drawing the distinctions I'm drawing as I'm drawing them, because I'm sympathetic to that view. I mean, I'm not a kind of anti pagan polemicist. I'm a Christian Platonist to the core. And my old teacher, Wayne Henke, would not have allowed me to be a Christian polemicist in that sense. I would have been scolded very, very sternly. So I think everything you say is right. Maybe the issue is that even though what you say is true, I think maybe the Christian paradigm doesn't feel comfortable with that. Maybe, I don't know, what would you say about that? I think it doesn't fit within the Christian paradigm, but ultimately I think they're both talking about immanence, right? They're talking about all things are full of gods. In their own ways,
Yeah, and I mean, at the same time, there's also the transcendence of the fact that each God is super essential.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, again, in something not unlike what you're talking about in your paper, from each God, there's an entire procession
Mhm.
of powers, energei, and also subordinate beings. Each God has angels depending from them,
Yeah.
and so you have the whole hierarchy descending from each God.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for the mortal worshiper,
Mhm.
each God is accessible as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And the intermediaries, from a Platonic point of view, aren't separating you from your God. They're facilitating
Yeah.
the connection, and they're accounting for the individual difference
Mhm.
that's inherent in all of the kinds of finite participations of the gods.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think, I sort of see, the Christians trying to, in a way, maybe incorporate that pagan insight. That I think they want to preserve those values. I think Dionysius wants to preserve those values, and Maximus too, the importance of divine immanence, right? But they have to go about it differently, because everything you've described is very, fascinating and beautiful. But I think it doesn't fit in the Christian cosmology, right? I think there adjustments need to be made, and I think that's more my claim. I think that they have to articulate it differently. It's not a value judgment of one being better than the other.
It would fit into their cosmology if they didn't require an ontological proof that there is only one God.
Well, there is that, but that monotheistic commitment is.
If we simply said, because there's a reason why on my reading Proclus's system has to reach its apex in each God individually and uniquely, rather than in a collective. Because in any collective you have ontological determining factors. And so, because to put it provocatively, it would be compatible with Christian cosmology if Christian cosmology could be centered on one God, but not necessarily and inherently the only one.
But then it would no longer be Christian cosmology. It's what we've got, right?
Well,
Isn't there this, if I may jump in, isn't there this necessity that Christians talk about of, hey, God is one, but he's not just one, but we have to stop at three, right? So we do have, kind of the immediate presence of divinity in more than one person, but there's some sort of necessity of not going further than three with the Trinity.
Well, but that's because they're collapsing super essential persons, because a category of person, the equivalent is where Proclus talks about idiotes. You see, that's the equivalent of the talk about persons in the Christian context. But those persons, as we can see, when you say the three persons of the Trinity, well, of course, these are the three primary ontic hypostases for Proclus of being, life, and intellect, essentially, which are classes of gods for him. And the distinction between the superessential and the ontic is essentially collapsed in the Christian conception of person. The conception of person, and this, I think, is why they have to adapt the terminology somewhat, because I think that they recognize that they can't just quite take over the Platonic terminology. I think that Today, we've lost somewhat the sense of that distinction, and so the distinction between ultimate being and the superessential has become somewhat otiose. It's become somewhat a matter of just an eminence beyond being, but without the categorical difference of that we find in Proclus between the Henadic organization and ontic classes from top to bottom. And I mean, we see this in the Elements of Theology, where Proclus says very clearly, being, life, and intellect are different from the Henads because each one of them is a unified group.
Yeah, Dionysius does talk about being, life, and intelligence as processions, and he says, I'm not going to talk about the absolutely transcendent being, life, and wisdom, which is in the Godhead. I'm just going to talk about the being, life, and intelligence that comes down in the procession. So I don't know if you're taking into account maybe that distinction that he's making, where there is this kind of super ontic principle of which I think would be referring to the Trinitarian persons when he says the absolutely transcendent being, life, and intelligence, which I'm not going to talk about here. But if I'm
talking about by an eminence, that it's perfectly parallel. It's perfectly parallel, and so that's why I'm speaking of, admittedly a little provocatively.
Sure.
But this is what I'm speaking of as what I see as a virtually otiose distinction, or the distinction between being and that which is beyond being, becoming virtually otiose, rather than a really substantive henology, which is really distinct from ontology, which has really distinct characteristics and a really distinct formal structure. And that's the argument that I've consistently made, and that my late friend Professor Hankey and I had many searching conversations about over dinner tables.
Could I ask if the persons, the multiple henads that you're talking about, Professor Butler, which are the immediate presence of God, the immediate presence of the One, is there any kind of dynamism like was talked about in this talk, where there's kind of this iridescence, or is there no dynamism and iridescence behind the persons because they're just the complete presence?
No, there is. In fact, in an article of mine on the intelligible gods in the Platonic theology of Proclus, which you can easily find. It was published in Mythexis. I talk about this specifically in connection with Proclus's Platonic theology, where I talk about the procession of the ontic hypostases as being the expression of a dialectic within each henad, between essentially, in terms of Proclus, it's about the dialectic between limit, the unlimited, and its resolution in the mixture, which also in Proclus is the dialectic between existence and power in each henad, which is resolved in the procession of being itself, because the third moment of the first intelligible triad, if you'll pardon me getting a little technical with it, the third moment of the first intelligible triad is the moment of radical being. That's actually being itself, which emerges as a dialectic between the unity of each henad and the multiplicity of the powers within that henad. And so the synthetic unity, so to speak, of the ultimate henadic individuality and the multiplicity of the henad's powers, because the powers, Proclus says, are still also themselves superessential. So the first two moments of the first intelligible triad are still super essential. The first essential moment, the first ontic moment, is the third moment, mixture, which is in effect an intellective synthesis of the individuality of the Henad and the many powers. So that's the equivalent in Proclus, from my point of view, on my reading, of the kind of dynamism that you're talking about there, because it's the dialectical emergence of being from out of a tension, so to speak, within each Henadic person.
So in each person, there's this dynamism, but there's not a kind of dynamism between persons that kind of reflects off beyond the person. It's all contained.
No, there is, because with each successive hypostasis, each hypostasis being in essence a mode of activity, an energeia of some class of gods, you also get more mediation. And so there is a further kind of mediation among Henads that we get in the hypostasis of life in Proclus, which he fleshes out largely through a reading of Plato's Phaedrus. And then further, in the intellective order, you have even a richer mediation among the Henads, which gets explicated largely through reading of the Timaeus, of course. And so there's a dynamism within each Henad, and there's also a kind of an emergent community, let's say, among the Henads, which gets increasingly rich with the emergence of the intelligible intellective and then the intellective hypostasis. And then also, in fact, even in the hypostases below intellect, it also becomes enriched through the procession of psyche, where we begin to include in that divine community mortal worshipers as well. And we that's the point at which we start to get all kinds of lower ontic manifestations of the gods, such as heroes, for example, Daimones, what Iamblichus calls the greater genera, angels, daimones, and heroes. And so all of this is a process by which the divine community becomes richer and richer progressively, as it incorporates as much as it can, proceeding as far as it can to everything that can participate it to whatever degree, until you finally get to things that can participate only to a minimal degree. And so that would be the kind of process. The difference is that it's a divine community.
Yeah, that sounds that's interesting. It sounds different than what I was thinking of when I was talking of this desire for a personal communion. It's a receding horizon that you're sort of always never exhausting. Rather, what you're talking about seems like an emergence out from the gods into a richer and richer distinctions and community. So I think that's an interesting way to talk about the kind of dynamic personal interaction. But I wonder if it's ultimately satisfactory, if it just must continue to incorporate more and more immanent forms and richer distinctions. And so I'm still concerned about whether the dynamism of personal interaction just stops at each god, and there's no receding horizon of a totally unknowable divinity that's always receding.
Well, every god in that sense recedes. And this is why, for instance, in Damascus, you get the concept of an unparticipated dimension to each henad, which Proclus is ambiguous about and sometimes seems to imply that there is an aspect of each henad that that transcends participation, while at other times, and apparently more systematically, says no. I mean, the henad as such is participated. But I think part of what Damascius is getting at by instead making the notion of an unparticipated status of each henad, an ultimate unparticipated status of each henad, formal and systematic, is to precisely get at what Proclus himself says in many places when he will say that a finite soul can never adequately participate, for instance, all of the powers of any given deity. And so, for instance, when he talks in his commentary on the Cratylus about the many epithets of Apollo, and he says, very casually, as he says in many places, and of course, a finite soul couldn't possibly know what all of the powers of Apollo are, because it categorically outstrips us. So I mean, there is this kind of withdrawal, so to speak, of the henad, of the henadic individual from the mortal worshiper, but that's compensated, we could say, by the incredible profusion of opportunities of participation, because the reason why it recedes isn't that it withdraws itself from participation per se, but that no participation totalizes it. No participation exhausts it, because there's always the opportunity for a new way of participating the same God. There's always a new Apollo. There's always the possibility, and I mean, the tremendous diversity of cults and the fact that new cults can always emerge is something which is built into the system. And so if there's any problem with it, I mean, the problem is simply the profusion of opportunities for participation, the sheer profusion of the divine in the world. The problem, if it's a problem, is simply that the gods are everywhere. That all things are full of gods, if that's a problem.
I think it's kind of a wonderful, I don't think that's a problem at all. Yeah, no, wow. Well, that's thank you for that wonderful exposition on Proclus.
I didn't mean to speak for so long.
No,
it's great.
You're making the community richer and richer, and
it's great to have a Neoplatonic master in our midst. It's an unexpected surprise. So thank you very much. I have nothing to add to that other than just thanks for all of that.
Thank you for a very stimulating paper. I really appreciated it. It's a
thank you.
fine thing to do of an evening.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us, and thank you for being generous with your time. And Dr. Butler, thank you for your contributions as well. And absolutely, yeah. Anytime. So thanks again, Daniel, for the great paper. And I'm excited to read the fuller one as well.
Yeah, I'll send that to you at some point once I get it edited a little bit. And I guess I thank you for reaching out to me when I was in Thessaloniki. This email came out of nowhere, and guys had actually read a paper I'd written, which is always great because you write these things and who knows if anyone reads them. So very, very gratifying, and it's a wonderful thing you guys are doing here, clearly. So we'll talk again. There's you got some great things lined up, so I'll definitely be touching in the future.
All right. Well, great. Well,
Thanks a
good
lot.
evening to you, Daniel, and good evening to everyone else. Thanks for coming, and take care.
Okay, good night.